Welcome to Managing the Multiple Dimensions of Disruption, perhaps my longest title yet. Certainly wins the award for the greatest number of syllables in a title. And today we're going to be talking about basically the multiple elements of disruption that a business can go through. I'll be your host today, Tom Perry. I'm an agile transformation consultant and coach up here in the Seattle area. Author of the Little Book of Impediments, founder of the Agile Management Northwest Conference, and general Sherpa builder, innovator, and guy about town up here. So our agenda for today will be talking about an introduction to Big Bang disruption, estimating disruption, managing disruption, and what I hope represents a structured approach to how we can tackle disruption. So let's talk about Big Bang disruption first. Big Bang disruption has been characterized as something that is reflected with undisciplined strategy, which is that when disruption happens today, it happens along a variety of axes, and it's usually associated with adoption by social media, for example, Twitter feeds and Facebook feeds and things like that, where popularity dictates the adoption of something much more so than a lot of the strategic processes, a lot of the structured processes that used to be the case in the past. That unconstrained growth is much, much faster than normal. And so in the past, marketing might have felt they had some control over the growth and adoption strategy. But when you're operating in an environment that is uncontrolled through social media, et cetera, then the adoption rates are much, much greatly accelerated. And the development is also unencumbered. So when you're talking about Big Bang development or Big Bang disruption, the development is usually done using commoditized tools that are freely available or much, much more readily available than they were in the past. And so that ready availability of new and interchangeable technology means that it is much, much easier to adapt your product to changing ecosystems. All of that has led to a profound change in the way the product adoption curve works. The traditional product adoption curve was something that looked like an early majority where you had your early adopters. These are people who like to experiment with things, and these people were very, very different from what you might perceive as a late majority, which are people who are a bit more risk averse, but there are many, many more of them. These people wouldn't adopt a product until the early majority had clearly signaled that the product was stable and reliable. And then you had your laggards, and these are people who are slow to adopt any new technology whatsoever. And these folks would be the very tail enders who wouldn't adopt a technology until it had been around for a while. The disrupted adoption curve is much more of a tidal wave or shark fin, where you will have a couple of blips early on that may give you a hint that something is coming. And then when the adoption hits, as I suggested earlier, the sales will go, logarithmic on you very, very quickly, because the adoption is being done through social media and other channels. The communication is uncontrolled and viral. And so what happens is that the adoption curve is much, much steeper, almost instantaneous, and frequently overwhelming the infrastructure of the organizations that are quote unquote successful. And then just as steeply as it comes on, it can also wash through and go away just as rapidly, which can be just as difficult for the organization. This has four distinct phases that are associated with it. They're described as the singularity, the Big Bang, the Big Crunch, and entropy. The singularity is where early on the new technologies are being tested. And in that early phase, you'll have something like, for example, the Palm Pilot or the Newton. These are handheld devices that are coming to market, each independently relatively successful, but then not really taking off, not really going anywhere in the marketplace. And then it wasn't until you had the iPhone, which just took off and launched with much greater success, and had a huge adoption curve. And then soon afterwards, the initial iPhone, was history, and they had to come out with the new versions, subsequent versions of the iPhone. So the first iPhone had its big crunch, which is the 1.0 version, and then subsequently they had to come out with new versions to keep the market satisfied. And then ultimately, at the end of the day, there is the entropy phase where what remains of the market is adopting at this point, but it's just very, very slow. So radically different adoption curves that have radically different impacts on the market. The traditional adoption curve was something that was very predictable, and companies felt as though they could control it. The disruptive adoption curve is one that is uncontrolled. It is one that comes on extremely fast and also leaves just as quickly and causes a lot more chaos. The thing that I think I want folks to understand is that that disruption and that model of disruption is purely from a product marketing perspective, which is great. It's a legitimate perspective for many of us, but it actually is, in light of recent events, just one aspect of a much more complex situation. So if you look at the people who are affected by disruption, in the case of product marketing, you're talking about maybe large corporations, for example. But in the much larger picture here, we're all disrupted. So, as individuals, there are disruptions that affect us. Social groups, there are disruptions that affect us, whether they're as racial groups, ethnic groups, that sort of thing. And as business types, so small businesses have a different set of disruptions that impact them compared to large corporations. So large corporations frequently are diversified. So when a disruption happens, take GE, for example, they had a transportation division that made locomotives. Well, if the locomotive business went away, was disrupted for some reason, GE could go for decades without really acknowledging that disruption. Whereas if for smaller businesses, for smaller companies, if their entire market goes away, they're out of business. But for these large diversified corporations with lots and lots of resources, disruption has a completely different aspect to it than it does for smaller companies. And for us as individuals, disruptions can come from a variety of different places. If you stop and you start to think about the kinds of disruption that are out there, it turns out that it's much more sophisticated than just product and marketing disruption. So, markets being disrupted are important, but it turns out that recent events like the coronavirus and like the riots are all sources of additional disruption. There's economic disruption, social disruption, ecosystem disruption. There are a wide number of different kinds of disruption that are out there. And so these disruptions can reflect supply chain, trade wars, stock market crashes. The product disruption we're already familiar with. So it's innovation, commoditization, lowered transaction costs. All of those things can cause disruption to the product and marketing chain. But then on the ecosystem front, there are things like pandemics, global warming, extinctions. All of those things can cause disruptions and social disruptions. You have racial injustice and poverty and things like that. So it turns out that when we talk about disruption, there is a much richer ecosystem of potential disruptions that await us out there. And this is really at its very most abstract, this is really just the ecosystem of risk that is out there that awaits any of us, that we have to somehow try and manage. So you can look at the product technical risk, and that would be all of the disruptions that we were talking about in the beginning when we were talking about the big disruptions. There's political disruption, there's economic disruption, and ecological disruption. And these are very, very broad. And in fact, any of these, there could be probably additional kinds of disruption out there that I've failed to categorize here. It's only as I've realized that, between pandemics and social upheaval and murder hornets, God knows what the next one is going to be. All of these things are lurking out there, and that a pandemic can be just as destructive or just as disruptive to a business as stiff competition or new technology. All of those things are equally disruptive in their own way. So, what can we do to manage the disruption? I mean, it's one thing to identify this and say, okay, disruption and waves of disruption are rolling through the economy, rolling through our society in one way or another. But what do you do with that? So I think there are a couple of things that we can investigate. One is we need to be prepared. And so we do need to understand that it is increasingly likely, in today's fast-paced world, that we need to be prepared for disruption as a regular occurrence. Um, we need to have multiple strategies, we need to be flexible, and we're going to have to revisit the preparations we've made and change our plans on a regular basis. One of the things that I frequently refer people to is Ashby's Law, which states that the variety of challenge must be met with an equal variety in response. So if our environment is hitting us with a variety of challenges, it can be anything from environmental challenges to, I don't know, saber-toothed tigers. We need to have an answer for each challenge. Otherwise, the challenge will be unmet, and it will be uncontrolled, and we will suffer whatever the problem is. And so we need to make sure that we're able to respond appropriately to whatever these challenges are in our environment. If the variety of responses matches or is greater than the variety of stimuli, then we're likely to survive. If the variety of responses is lower than the variety of stimuli, then we're not likely to make it. So, one of the things that suggests is we need to be very, very adaptive in our responses, and we need to focus on being increasingly creative or adaptive when we are dealing with all of these incoming stimuli. So that means we need to be prepared. And in simple terms, that means we need to have options in front of us. We need to have different ways or different things that we might do to handle the situation. And that toolkit is going to vary from individual to individual and business to business. And it will also be the toolkit that we go to when we're looking at how are we going to respond to a given situation. Then we need to have multiple options. So it could be that the toolkit that we would use for fighting fires is going to be a completely different toolkit from the one that we use for mountain climbing. So all of the options that we have and all of the creative ideas we have for handling scenario A may not apply for scenario B. So we need to have many different options or many different toolkits at hand or possible toolkits at hand so that we can change direction. Because one of the things that can happen is when we have big disruptions come through, our entire business may have to change direction very, very quickly. It means we have to be very, very flexible in our thinking and in our approach. And that, for some folks, is very difficult. One of the things that we're seeing in today's world with the pandemic is that there are some businesses that are refusing to acknowledge the pandemic, that are refusing to acknowledge that change needs to happen, and they're just going to wait it out. And somehow, by waiting it out, they hope that they will survive long enough, and perhaps they have the resources to do this, to survive long enough that business will come back to them, that the status quo will return to normal at some point, and they will be able to just pick right back up where they left off. In some cases, if you're a very large organization, that might be possible. However, if you're a small organization, it's much less likely you're going to have the resources to be able to do something like that. And of course, one of the things we need to do is, even if we find an option that works, we need to keep iterating. We need to keep going back and looking at our options and looking at our strategies that we have and asking the question, what else could we do? What other alternatives are there? And preparing ourselves, because even if you get through one disruption, that's not to say there's not another one right around the corner. And I think that's another key lesson here that 2020 is teaching us all right now, which is, if you think the first disruption is bad, there's another one awaiting right behind it. We saw that with the pandemic. We're seeing that with the rioting now, and God knows what's coming next. So the idea here is that we need to get better and better at coming up with suites of alternatives so that we can flex from one disruption to the next. And that's where I'm going to suggest that perhaps having some sort of structured approach is useful. And this is what I'm going to suggest. This is actually a set of services that I'm starting to provide, which is, you need an initial consultation. There are businesses out there that are trying to figure out what to do next. And we need to understand the business, we need to understand the people, and we need to understand their context. And then we need to help them with coming up with a suite of ideas, a suite of concepts that they can use to help manage the disruption that's coming their way. And it needs to be a lot of different things. Then we need to take those ideas that have been generated and we need collect them and visualize them. So people need a place they can go to where they can see an idea board or some sort of map of all of the ideas, so that they can think about these things and look at these options when the time comes. And then on a periodic basis, we need to keep that list of ideas mature, healthy, and well structured. And that's where we need to be reviewing and refining the idea set, looking at the ideas, pruning the ones that won't work, and keep adding new ones that we discover along the way. So every business now needs to be going through an iterative process of assessment, idea generation, idea visualization, and then perhaps idea pruning of some sort or refinement. This is going to become an essential business activity. And really, what you're talking about there is a kind of strategy conversation. Strategy conversations are relatively easy within larger organizations. They'll have entire groups dedicated to it, but this is especially necessary and hard to do if you're a small organization or an individual. So this strategic approach, this structured approach, is something that I think is of huge benefit, a big opportunity for these smaller organizations. So with those organizations, we want to do an initial consultation. We want to get to know people. We want to understand their goals, uncover their why, and figure out what outcomes they're trying to achieve. Those outcomes are going to be changing and very dynamic. And then we want to get an agreement to move forward. Then we want to hold an innovation workshop, and this is going to vary based on the kind of organization and what they do. But this is where we want to do the brainstorming to come up with the different scenarios and the different ideas and techniques that might be business generators that you can fall back on when your existing business has been disrupted. And so when that happens, you want to have something to fall back on, like the organizations, like restaurants that switched from in restaurant seating to delivery, and like the salons that switched from haircuts in the salon to shipping out hair coloring and other services as an export. So it's these sorts of shifts in the business that we want to be as prepared for as possible so that we're ready to go on a moment's notice. And then, of course, we want a tool to visualize all of this. And this is another thing that we're working on providing right now, which is basically a tool like a lean canvas or an idea board or mind maps, some way of capturing these ideas so that we can see them and share them with others and review them with others. And then on a periodic basis, we want to be coaching and reviewing the material and making sure that we're refining the material as we move forward. So the ideas behind the Big Bang Disruption came from this book, Big Bang Disruption by Larry Downes and Paul Nunes. And I think this basically covers just the marketing side of things. So the additional context for disruption that talks about ecological, political, and economic disruption, those ideas are my own. But the idea of basically product or marketing disruption come from this book, which is called Big Bang Disruption. If you're interested in some of these services, I'm starting to offer business innovation services, product innovation services, and even career innovation services for small businesses, dedicated for small businesses that are dealing with disruptions, just like the pandemic that we're dealing with right now, just like the riots and the racial strife. So this is something I see as directly addressing the sorts of challenges that businesses are facing right now, especially small businesses. If you're interested, there's plenty more content where this came from. There's a YouTube channel as well as a blog. So check those out. And let's build something great together. Thank you very much.